but I don't think everybody in our community completely understands. And as Arrow said, it is no longer the future of trade. It is trade today. It's trade today and in the future. And we're really grateful to all of you for joining us. For those of you who are watching, we are going to take a very short break. We're going to just a couple of minutes while we load up our next panel, which is our final one of the day. We have the ambassadors, several ambassadors joining us from the EU, the UK, Brazil, and Australia, along with our dear friend, Ambassador Sue Schwab, that'll be joining us. So thank you again, Arrow, Jason, Peter, and Sarah. You can turn off your cameras. We're gonna not cut off the broadcast though. We're gonna be coming right back to all of you in just a minute. Thank you very, very much. As we close out our panel today, I'm going to ask our ambassadors to please turn on their cameras and join us online as we try to get started with our final panel for the day. Thank you. So as we close out our conference today, I could not be more pleased than to welcome back our good friend and conference co-chair, Ambassador Susan Schwab. Susan has been so generous with her time for WTA, and we are delighted to welcome you back to the WTA stage, even though it's, of course, online this year and not live and in person. Before I introduce our illustrious panel, though, I want to shout out to at least one person who is in our audience today. Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who is expected to be named the next Director General of the WTO. We were privileged to host Dr. Ngozi at a WTA webinar when she was candidate to be Director General, and we're delighted she could join us today in our audience. I hope I'm not being premature in congratulating her on her expected hopeful history-making appointment, and we hope will be affirmed by the WTO in the days to come. We're also delighted to welcome today's panel, and we're very grateful to the ambassadors for joining us. Again, my good friend, Ambassador Susan Schwab, Ambassador Stavros Lambrinidis, the EU Ambassador to the United States, who was with us at this conference last year live in person, Ambassador Arthur Sinodinos, Australia's Ambassador to the United States of America, Dame Karen Pierce, Britain's Ambassador to the United States of America, and Ambassador to Nestor Forster, Brazil's Ambassador to the United States. Thank you all for joining us today. At Wto, we like to explore the landscape of trade policy from our base in Washington. But for us to get the whole picture, we need to know what the trade landscape looks like from your perspectives. That's why we're so pleased to have you here today and hear from you about what is important to your countries in dealing with the United States and with your trading partners around the world. With that, Susan?
Ken, thank you very much. Welcome, ambassadors. Very much appreciate you joining us today. This Wto event is near and dear to my heart, and we have a terrific audience with us today and lots of questions to cover. I would start by suggesting that the audience, if you are interested in these illustrious ambassadors' biographies, you turn to the program. Because I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on biographies because I have lots of questions to ask. In terms of other diplomatic niceties, I am told that it is best for me to be posing questions in the order in which our ambassadors presented their credentials in Washington. So that is the order that I am going to use, but we'll mix it up a little bit, and I'm looking forward also to your questions. Let me start with Ambassador Stavros Lambrinidis, who is the head of delegation, as you know, from the European Union to the United States. I guess I should start, since the EU, and I know from the list of members of the audience, a lot of your colleagues, folks who work for you, have been participants in this program today. Lots and lots of EU questions have arisen about digital trade, about EU and China, about the US-EU, about the WTO. I'm going to start then with sort of an open-ended question, asking you, what would you consider the top two issues that need to be addressed between the US and the EU this year?
Thank you. It's first of all, it's great to be here with everyone, and I will drop all the diplomatic niceties and address you as Susan.
Please.
And I encourage you to address me as Stavros, because the Lambrinidis, I understand, can be a hurdle for most people. So it's always difficult to boil everything down to two priorities. You probably know that we put out an 11-page document, sort of a blueprint that we proposed to the Biden administration for cooperation in 4 major fields. One is COVID health. How do we get out of this? The other one is the environment and climate. The third one has to do with trade, economy. And the fourth one has to do with foreign policy, values, etc. And if you think about it, trade is a silver sort of string that goes throughout every one of them, and will facilitate every one of these priorities. But okay, here's 2. The first thing I hope that we can do is to get rid very quickly of some of the very unnecessary but quite disruptive trade irritants of the past few years. So when you look at the tariffs that were imposed against the EU as a quote unquote national security threat of the US when it comes to steel and aluminum. Tariffs that forced us on our side to impose other tariffs, countermeasures on many US goods going to the EU. That has hurt very much both our economies, hundreds of thousands of people working in them. They were illegal tariffs. They shouldn't have been imposed, and we are ready to raise our own tariffs immediately the moment that the U.S. raises its own so-called Section 232 tariffs. That could be a very positive, very strong signal to thousands of workers across the Atlantic and businesses. Second priority, I would say, for us, it is to focus on the all-important nexus between trade, technology, and security. So as we move forward, we know, we've seen it today, that how it is that we organize the international scene when it comes to artificial intelligence and the standards that we set for it. Democratic standards, one would hope, not the kind of standards that China and others are putting in place using AI to repress people, but also not standards that lack transparency, such as algorithms for major social media that have so often spurred the most extreme division in our societies. That kind of discussion has to happen between the United States and the European Union, the two biggest, most open markets, the two biggest democracies in the world. Think of cybersecurity and all that we need to work together on to fortify that area. Think of the responsibility of major platforms. Think of, on the security part of the Nexus, foreign direct investment screenings and export controls. These are areas that the two biggest economies in the world have to discuss and coordinate, because we have been the biggest innovators, both in terms of actual technology itself, but also in terms of regulation. The biggest innovators in the world, and setting the standards there is going to affect every corner of the world. So that's why we have proposed as the European Union the immediate launch of what we call a Trade and Technology Council, which would be a major bilateral forum to discuss and to address all these issues. And that's it. These are the two priorities. There are many more, but but let me stick with those.
Susan, reminder to unmute yourself.
Was this the turn of phrase of the decade? You're still on mute. Thank you very much appreciate. Great opening. And in fact, your points, Mr. Ambassador, tie in very much with some of the other issues, as you know, that have been raised earlier today. So let me start with the first one, which is a U.S. EU call it disarmament, call it settling differences that arose in the course of the last administration. But in fact, one could look at what happened in the last administration and point to overcapacity and oversupply issues that are at the core of what generated many of the tariffs, particularly the 232 tariffs. And that then is also tied to your second point, where you're talking about technology, whether it is foreign direct investment, CFIUS type export control issues, and even the human rights issues that you alluded to. And I note that prior to coming here, you were the EU special representative for human rights. All of those take us to US-EU relations vis-a-vis China. And can I ask you, because both technology and China have been panels earlier today, to talk a little bit about how you see that evolving, because obviously EU companies have a lot of interests in China, as do US companies. And yet some of the issues that you've spoken of very much involve Chinese companies and our relations, not just with each other, but also relations with China.
Absolutely, and thank you for this. So let's take the issue of the national security tariffs, steel, aluminum. You're absolutely right to say that the overcapacity issue of China is the real problem. It's not the European Union creating a national security threat. It is a major subsidization program in China that's been happening for years, and that creates the overcapacity that then creates issues both for the EU and the US. So we are entirely ready to discuss with the United States ways to deal with that overcapacity. In fact, we have been doing this already in terms of Chinese state subsidies, but also other major subsidies through a trilateral discussion between the US, the EU, and Japan, trying to look at how to change the WTO rules in this context. Looking at China again and looking at another trade dispute that we have with the US, the Airbus and Boeing dispute, a dispute going on for 15 years now. We both lost the cases at the WTO. It would make a tremendous amount of sense to sit down and to settle the cases. Instead, the US imposed tariffs against Airbus, and then we had to impose tariffs against Boeing. So we're entirely ready, and we hope that we can freeze immediately those tariffs on both sides for at least 6 months and sit down and try to settle the case. Why is that important? Where does China come into this? Well, we have to look at future subsidy principles for this major industry. And as we are fighting with each other, China is building aircraft, 100% subsidized aircraft without any controls that could be flooding the market in a few years' time. You want to talk about a real security threat and an economic threat? Maybe that's it. So again, we have to look at that. And finally, let me just say about China more broadly. China is a country with which both the Biden administration and we in Europe since 2019 have recognized that it is a country that we have to speak to and cooperate with on some issues that we need China's participation. Climate change is the most classic example. Non-proliferation is another one. China is the biggest polluter today in the world. We cannot move on addressing climate change unless we talk to China and we have a common plan to get this done together. China is also a very strong and a very unfair competitor when it comes to economy and trade. And we have emphasized this in our own strategy to China. And of course, the Biden administration has done the same thing. And China is also a systemic rival when it comes to governance and rights. It's not something you can negotiate. They have a system that is against the democratic systems that we have and the values that we hold. And we have to counter that attempt of China to export its system also to other countries around the world. At the same time, China is a very big economy in which both, as you said, US companies and EU companies have an interest in engaging. There have been discussions about decoupling, although it wasn't ever clear to me, at least, whether or not that was the official policy or the policy of some and not others. The fact is that there's certainly areas in which you can discuss a greater economic sovereignty for the EU and the US, and COVID brought some of these areas to the forefront. But I don't think either side of the Atlantic considers to be realistic to decouple. So the question is, what do you do? Well, in my view, you have to do two things, and let me close it with that. The first thing you have to do is you have to run faster than China, and the second thing that you have to do is you have to protect the runners. So, in other words, we simply have to invest much more effectively and much more massively and much more strategically in all these areas of our economies that need to develop very fast. And that includes digital. And that is a commitment we've made in Europe, but also includes the climate transition and transformation. If we manage to be the first movers in those two areas, then not only will we run faster, and it's not just a Chinese issue, it's a broader world issue, but we will also be able then to support numerous other countries around the world in their own transitions in a way that also respects the values that we believe in and that we promote, and that other technological developments may not respect them, correct? Now, the second thing we have to do is we have to protect the runners. So we cannot have this happening and then China and others stealing intellectual property or keeping the markets closed or unfair or unbalanced while expecting their own fully subsidized companies to be coming in our markets. So in that sense, what we did, including in the recent agreement of investment, is for the first time, we ensured a level playing field for those investments and transparency in the Chinese market and their subsidies and other things that never existed before. And this is a springboard because it also now, everything we achieved will apply also to US investments, to talk with the US together about how do we transfer and how do we strengthen those initial steps with China in the multilateral system. We also included provisions for the first time an economy that tries to leverage its economic might with China to talk about sustainable development, tying down China to its Paris commitments when it comes to investment. And we also included market access conditions, including in services, which are most favored nation, which means that they apply also to the US. But, you know, we have to fight the unfair Chinese practices, the forced technology transfer, the forceful joint venturing, the IP theft, all those things, because we have to protect those runners. Run faster, run better, protect the runners, ensure that the EU and the US together set the standards for the major technologies of the future so that others who don't believe in our values don't set them for us. That is a full agenda, and it's a great agenda. And it's one that we are ready to jump in immediately with the Biden administration.
Ambassador Lambrinidis, thank you very much. I've got your comments have generated lots of other questions. However, I will come back. But for right now, I am going to move on to Ambassador Sinodinos, and welcome.
Thank you.
And I am going to start actually by jumping off of the last set of answers and starting with China before going on to US-Australia issues, because Australia has been for the last, 18 months, sort of the punching bag for China on trade issues. Canada had that privilege before that. And so Australia really has been, Australia, certainly from a trade perspective, really has been the victim of some seriously unfair trade practices when it comes to China. And I would be interested in any comments you might have about that. What kind of public response has there been in Australia, and what kind of support or lack thereof has there been from your trading partners?
Well, thanks, Susan, and thanks very much for the opportunity to be with you. Look, on China, let me say this. Over the last few years, what's happened is because Australia has taken a number of decisions in a number of areas, not just trade, but national security related, which have been based on principles and areas reflecting our national interest or our sovereignty, we've had pushback from China, whether it's around the role of Huawei and ZTE in the telecommunications system, around foreign interference in universities or in the electoral process or in political parties. And more recently, of course, we had some blowback because of our involvement in calling for an independent inquiry into the origins of the coronavirus. There have been a number of others, but these are major milestones, if you like, along the way. And it's true. In doing that, we have attracted the ire of China at a time when it's our major trading partner. And it's in our interest to have a strong and prosperous relationship with China, but not at the expense of areas of national interest and sovereignty. And so for us, we've essentially taken the view that we need to weather the storm, and that our pitch to the US, the EU, like-minded partners in the region is that if we want China to be less assertive or aggressive and to be a more productive member of the international community, then we need to act together. And it really goes to some of the points that Stavros raised earlier around having an understanding among ourselves about how we push back on economic coercion, how we promote international standards, and the importance of the US playing a leading role in this. So, for example, in the case of the Indo-Pacific region, it's about how do we further deepen our economic engagement amongst like-minded partners in the region. The US, we want more involved in the region. We recognize, for example, that it won't be easy for the US at this stage to enter into major trade agreements, given the domestic focus. We want them at some stage to reconsider the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We see that as beneficial for economic reasons and for strategic reasons in terms of an emphatic statement of the US commitment to the region. We welcome the fact that the UK is now looking at joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We think that's great. So from our perspective with the US, it's really, and EU and others, it's really around how do we work together to push back on these areas, evolve policies around subsidies, state-owned enterprises, intellectual property theft, all of those points that were raised before. How do we strengthen multilateral organizations that are important in this regard, including how do we make sure the World Trade Organization operates as it should? If there are reforms to be made to the structure or operation of the WTO, the appellate body, for example, what does that require as a way of encouraging the US to be more productively involved? In the case of Australia, initially we're looking to negotiate a bilateral digital trade agreement, or if they want a multilateral one, we can look at that. Digital trade agreement, important stepping stone to further setting standards in our region, important particularly for small businesses in our region. So digital trade agreement is something that's on our short-term horizon. More broadly, we're looking at things like the TPP, and then we're looking at working with other like-minded partners in how do we come together with strategies that will bolster the multilateral system, particularly around trade and investment. And to Stavros's point, whenever you make an agreement with China, it's a good thing if what it is doing is setting up a set of rules that have to be mutually observed. The question then becomes, of course, how do you enforce those? And that's where working together will be important. So if our priority engaging with the Biden administration is to recognize that they do have a domestic focus, that they will make labor, environmental standards and other issues part of their trade negotiating strategy. Carbon adjustments may come into this as well as we go looking at the intersection with climate change. The other point I would make is that we're also talking to the administration about how supply chains are reconfigured in the light of the pandemic, not in a protectionist way, but how do like-minded countries work together, particularly around the critical technologies that were identified before, the ones that impact our prosperity, our national security, and our social cohesion.
That is very, very, very interesting. Let me push you a little bit on the and I think people who are watching this and who watched, for example, the last panel on digital trade would embrace so much of what you have to say. Let me push you a little bit, though, on multilateral institutions and enforcement of agreements, because in my observation, regardless of what excuse China has used to stop your wine and stop your barley and stop your lobsters or whatever, generally SPS issues, SPS excuse, sanitary, phytosanitary excuses, those are bogus. Those are clearly not the reasons. And we've seen other countries use sanitary and phytosanitary rationales for what are clearly geopolitical trade actions. China's done it frequently, and in fact has lost at least one case of the WTO. And yet, what can we do, for example, at the WTO? What are we thinking of doing? What is Australia, what are Australia's allies perhaps considering in a multilateral venue where one should be able to enforce against those kinds of practices?
I think the important thing is for nations not to be seen as being capable of being picked off on their own, right? So if nations are acting together and being of common mind about pushing back, that sends a very powerful signal. The weight of countries and GDP doing that is a signal that China in particular will pick up. There's a calculus of costs and benefits for them. We have to change the calculus of costs and benefits so that they feel that it's more beneficial to actually cooperate with the global rules-based order rather than seek to upend it in some way. Of course, there's no perfect solution to any of this, but solidarity and setting strong international standards, coordinating candidacies in international bodies so that people who are in those bodies reflect that broad spectrum of values that underpin the rules-based order we've had the benefit of since 1945 will go a long way in that regard.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Would you like, before I move to our next ambassador, would you like to add anything about the most significant trade issues that you see between the US and Australia, recognizing that the last 4 years, the US has not been the easiest trading partner for our trading partners?
Well, there was reference before to Section 232, but again, there are structural issues that have to be addressed if that's to be sorted. And I think Stavros was right on that. In terms of bilateral issues, our main focus on is how we build on the existing relationship. And we believe that the focus of this administration on working with other partners is a very good message for us. And I've mentioned the trade priorities that we've got. There are also security priorities that are linked with that as well.
And many of the ones, by the way, reflected in the last administration are carried over into this administration. So these are American priorities, not Republican or Democrat priorities. Okay, terrific. Thank you so very much. And I have additional questions for you too, and we'll swing back to that. But in the meantime, let me move to Dame Pierce from the UK and welcome you to the Wto program. I think this is your first Wto program, right? Welcome you to the Wto program. This is a wonderful organization. And it's obvious that the UK, when it comes to trade, has had a whole lot on its plate over the last several years. And so it's hard to know where to start. So I'm going to start just with, what would you say is the top challenge, opportunity when it comes to US UK trade? Let's start with the top challenge, UK-US trade.
Well, thanks very much, Susan, and thanks very much to WITA for inviting me. And great to be here with the other ambassadors, and a real honor to have Dr. Ngozi join us. So thanks for that. I think there are some challenges that are shared and some challenges that are between US and UK. I think the ones that are shared, as Arthur and Stavros said, they all relate to COVID economic recovery. How do we get ahead of the pandemic? How do we show that open societies, democratic values are the way out of this and not authoritarianism? How do we use technology and the developments that are coming for the benefit of citizens, not to spy on them? So I think those are huge challenges that involve all of your speakers and panel today. And we, the Brits, host the G7. We have the presidency this year. So one big strand of our work, right the way through technology, health, security, foreign ministers, sectors, and obviously economic resilience is going to focus on that. So that's the biggest shared challenge. I think between US and UK, we have a Section 232 problem. As Stavros was saying, we have a share, if you like, of that initial dispute. We want to resolve it. I think it's striking, Susan, whenever I talk to people from Airbus or from Boeing, everybody says they want to resolve this issue, but nobody seems quite able to make the first step. We have said we will suspend application of tariffs on our side in the hope that the new administration will see that as a gesture and we can get moving. But we want to cooperate with our European partners on that. And then I think there's the FTA itself. We would like to conclude this. We made a good amount of progress with the previous administration. We hear what the Biden administration says about trade deals. I don't want to be presumptuous about their position. This is something we'd like to pick up with the USTR when she's confirmed. But within that, I think we all know that agriculture is always a very difficult issue. You know yourself, Susan, USTRs are very fierce. They're very good negotiators. We're not under any illusions about that. We think we've got some good negotiators as well. So this will be something that we have to work out. And then I think financial services. We have really good trade in services between the UK and the US. One can always have more, but I think we all know that financial services, partly because of their complexity, are one area that is always difficult to find new measures for. But those are the things I'd highlight for the moment.
So that is a terrific list. Let me ask you a little more on the potential trade agreement side. Obviously, there's a time constraint there. Trade Promotion Authority expires at the end of June of this year. And whatever progress was made in the last administration, there's clearly a Trade Promotion Authority timetable that would require a significant amount of progress, shall we say, by April, and then something signable by July 1. I would note, from my perspective, if both governments really want to get it done, generally, given the shared interests, it should be a doable proposition. On the other hand, the Biden administration has said that this is a different, they have trade, they want a worker-focused trade program, and they've got other priorities before trade agreements. So in your initial conversations so far, recognizing that USTR designate tie has not been confirmed yet, in your initial conversations, have you gotten a sense of where this is likely to go, or is it a little too early?
Well, when I talk to people on the Hill from both parties, when I talk to governors in states around America from both parties, there's a lot of enthusiasm for a free trade deal with the UK. And I think it's fair to say it's what you would term a bespoke deal. It could, as you say, Susan, it could be got through Congress if the legislative timetable, if space could be found. But as I say, we're not presumptuous. We recognize, as Arthur said, that this administration has a very strong domestic focus. We recognize the importance of getting to grips with COVID recovery. I would argue that the FTA itself assists COVID recovery. It's a sign of confidence in global economic revival, and it puts a lot of emphasis on small and medium-sized enterprises, which will be essential to that recovery in both US and UK. And it also puts a lot of emphasis on digital commerce. In fact, I think I'm right in saying it may be the first FTA were it to pass that would actually have digital trade as a major plank. We don't want to just get it done for the sake of getting it done. We want a comprehensive deal rather than a quick one. And we recognize that a Biden administration may well want to add in things on labor, on the environment, particularly to do with climate. We'd be very ready to meet those requirements. But I think, as you say, we wait for the USTR to be confirmed, and then we will want to take all this forward with her and her team.
Yeah, makes sense, and I would also reinforce your point about how important agriculture is, certainly to trade politics everywhere. But as a former agricultural trade negotiator, I will tell you it is impossible to get a trade agreement through in the United States Congress without happy farmers.
Yeah, I think we all appreciate that.
Anyway, thank you very much. Let me move on to Brazil, and I'm going to loop back again because I have additional questions for all of you. But Ambassador Forster, I was going to say welcome. I noted that you presented your credentials in December, and then I went to your bio and realized that this is actually your fourth tour in Washington, and you were chargé d'affaires just before this. So you have interacted with a lot of your colleagues in person before we all got locked down. So still, welcome to WTO, even though I'm sure you've interacted with WTO before. Let me start with a bilateral question. Brazil's top trade priority vis-a-vis the US, and then Brazil's top trade priority that has nothing to do with the US.
Very good. Thank you, Ambassador Schwab. Thank you, Wto, for the opportunity to participate in this conversation with my colleagues and with you today. Look, in what regards our priority with the United States, what we want to do is to continue to expand our economic and trade cooperation. We just signed 3 state-of-the-art agreements in the areas of trade facilitation, good regulatory practices, and measures to fight corruption connected to trade this past October. So we have to make sure that those are well implemented. More broadly, those are seen as perhaps stepping stones towards a broader, more ambitious agreement. We see the private sector engaged on both sides, both on the Brazilian and the American side, very interested in a broader agreement. We get the message that the Biden administration has its own priorities, at least for this first year of the new administration. We get that, but we think we could use the time, perhaps to continue to pave the way towards something more ambitious. We see support for that from the private sector, as I said, and from others. So that would be a big priority. These agreements we have just signed perhaps will help us do the biggest free trade agreement that Brazil can do, which is not with the United States, or the big one we did with the European Union just 2 years ago, but with ourselves, reducing the cost of doing business in Brazil, cutting red tape, getting rid of unnecessary bureaucracy, etc. So this will certainly help. On the second front, I'll join the coalition against Section 232 here, and say that we too feel that we need to address this. This is not the wisest measure taken by the previous administration. We see that this hurts American companies, American consumers, and ultimately American workers. I don't want to make too much of a case on the Brazilian steel, but it's such an integrated industry that uses American coal and then processes and then sends the semi-manufactured product back to the United States, which I think would be in very much both sides' interest to get rid of those. But the non-US priority, perhaps if you let me, I'll mention two, and just opening for further discussion. One is to for us and our European friends, since Stavros is here, to continue to move forward in finalizing the legal scrub and working to implement our agreement, perhaps by the end of this year. It took us 20 years to negotiate the Mercosur European Union agreement, the largest free trade agreement, regional free trade agreement ever. And it would be a shame if it would take another 20 years to implement it. I think we can do it this year, and I think we should concentrate our resources towards that end. The other big priority has been mentioned by you, but by others, is WTO reform. We need to address the current challenges around the world, including those that go well beyond the trade. I think it's in everybody's interest to have a working, strong set of multilateral rules working. There are obvious things that everybody knows we need to do in a multilateral way, like revitalizing the appellate body, making the dispute settlement system work again to the benefit of the whole system. That's one thing. I think we also should be ambitious about the MC12 coming up with the agenda that's set before us of dealing with e-commerce and extending the moratorium on taxation on electronic transactions. I think we should put on the table the whole questions of agricultural subsidies, perhaps industrial subsidies as well. Allow the organization to proceed on what's so-called the plurilateral format, giving more room for new initiatives, for thinking outside the box, and for a coalition of the willing in many instances. But in an overall way, reform the organization so it fulfills its mandate and helps us to cope with the challenges that come from non-market economies like ourselves. So that would be basically those set of priorities at this point.
That is an incredible list, and I'm gonna draw you out a little bit on this. Having Dr. Ngozi Iweala watching this program, I think it's pretty obvious that we have a consensus here about the importance of the WTO. No question that all of us feel very strongly that the WTO, if it didn't exist, we would have to invent it, and that we're committed to making it work. But we've come up with a very long list of to-dos for the WTO. And for those of you who watched our earlier panels, we've got a lot of digital trade issues, e-commerce issues, privacy versus digital trade flows. We have issues associated with non-market economies and heavy subsidies. We've talked about overcapacity. We've talked about SPS in agriculture. So we've got this long list of to-dos at the WTO, not to mention the ones that always come to the top of the list that Ambassador Forster, you mentioned, the appellate body, and the WTO as a venue for negotiating how would you prioritize? And I'm going to start with you with this question, Ambassador Forster. If any of my other colleagues on this call want to comment, I will turn to you, and let me invite the audience to use the Q&A to list your questions, and we'll go to questions soon. Do you have would you like to, you came up with such a wonderful list of to-dos for the WTO. Would you like to give us some priorities? I mean, I agree with you entirely about trade facilitation and the importance of that. MC12, give me a sense, if you had to pick one or two, or how you'd start, where would you start?
I think we should, be ambitious. If we start with small-mindedly, we will not go very far. I think we should work on the three pillars of the organization. So we talked a lot about the dispute settlement mechanism that needs to be revamped, and the sooner the better, in a multilateral fashion. And but we also should tackle the whole question of negotiations. I mentioned some areas here that might be conducive for that. I understand we are advanced in the whole question of fishing also for the MC12. And on the third pillar, also on the whole question of monitoring and transparency, I think that's absolutely crucial, that we make sure the organization is very well endowed to function in that critical area, considering the challenges we have from some of the current membership. So that would be, the priority is, let's make the WTO work again. How we do that, we approach it, we tackle all the three pillars, and we are as ambitious as realistically possible.
Okay, if you don't go big, you'll never win big. I get that. Okay. Any other comments, Stavros? Anyone else want to comment on the WTO and WTO revitalization?
I don't, Susan, I don't want to take too much time on this because Dr. Ngozi is here indeed, and let me join in with Karen, and I'm sure everyone here, in expressing both our honor to have her with us, assuming she's still on, and even if she isn't, and all success in her new duties, assuming her final confirmation. Now that the United States, we were very pleased to see also supports her candidacy. So, look, one issue that we've had in the past was with the paralysis that came upon the appellate body. This is not an easy issue to resolve. There's no question about this, and we'll also be speaking very extensively with Catherine Tai and others here to see how we move forward. But in some ways, that also is connected to the rule changes that are necessary. So it's entirely unfair to be attacking the referee when your problem is with some of the rules of the game. So we have to be able to focus on that, on those changes, as Nestor has mentioned as well. So, prioritizing is going to be important, but having at the helm of WTO a person who is so deeply experienced and able to promote those issues, I think that was the first step to begin the process, and now we have this, and that's great.
I agree with that entirely. I would also note that the U.S. is very lucky to have Catherine Tai nominated. Hopefully the Senate will act quickly to confirm her, but she is a terrific nominee to be United States Trade Representative, and can make a really fundamental contribution to this exercise. Yes, Karen.
Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt. No, I think you're absolutely right about that. We're going to have some very strong trade people at the top of all the bodies who really want to sort this out, and that's worth a lot. I was going to highlight the China question specifically, the level playing field question. This is not to denigrate the Chinese people. China has done amazing things in lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. But when it comes to commerce and economic relations with all of us, there does need to be a level playing field. And I don't think we can ignore that question if we want to settle some of the other things we've got to do.
I think that's a very good point, and this is actually a good point for me to segue over to Ken, because I noted in the chat there are China-related questions, so well anticipated. My thank you to our ambassadors. Thank you very, very much for joining us. And now let me go to Ken to raise the questions that our audience had raised.
Thank you, Ambassador Schwab. Susan, I'm really grateful to you. You are a superstar trade negotiator and a superstar moderator, so thank you for that. We do have several questions that have come in that, dig in a little bit more on some of the issues we talked about. Ambassador Lambrinidis, we did have a question that came in from one of our interested stakeholders about the Boeing Airbus dispute and why you think it might, it's been going on for 17 years at this point. Do you think why is it going to take another 6 months to work out things that might take that long when these issues are pretty well established and the WTO has made its rulings? Seems like we should be able to wrap this up fairly quickly.
I don't know who asked the question, but I want them on my negotiation team because look, I certainly we agree with that, but 6 months is a reasonable amount of time when a new administration comes in. There's still no USTR in place and etc. But the fact of the matter is that this has been going on for too long. The industry now is going to be facing some major challenges in the future, especially as we are also transitioning to climate supportive technologies, including in the airline industry. And that's going to require a tremendous amount of investment and some support. So when we say that we have to be discussing the future principles for the industry, this is precisely what we're talking about. And this is the kind of discussion that, I don't think anything is too easy. When something is going on for 15 years and is not resolved, and I'm sitting here thinking that it should have been, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe, in fact, there are difficulties out there that I haven't seen. But you know why it's easier now? Because, in fact, we had those 15 years and we went through all the soul searching. And it's not that big of a mystery anymore what needs to be done. Now, whether or not it can be done fast or not, we'll figure it out. But I am very hopeful because, as I said again, we're not the only two elephants in this room. There are others that are pushing themselves in, and they're not doing playing fairly. And it is simply in our own self-interest. Plus, which industry has been hurt more than any other industry during COVID? Well, it's certainly the airline industry and the millions of people who supply it and depend on it and other industries around it. Could there be a stronger message that we send to our workers in the United States, in the EU, in the UK, anywhere around the world, a stronger message than that we are serious about resolving this fast and now? I don't believe so. And if we manage to do this, the markets will pick up like crazy, because this is the kind of hope that they expect to be given by the major open markets in the world as we're coming out of COVID. So I think everything is in place. And anyone who can tell me how to do it in less than 6 months, I'm all ears.
Well, we'll make that connection for you, Mr. Ambassador, with the interested party who asked the question. You can peek into the Q&A function yourself and see who that is. Thank you for that. We have a couple questions that came in regarding, and this goes to EU, but it also goes to the U.S. negotiations with the UK, and I think with Australia and Brazil as well. But talking about the cautionary principle in trade. And taking actions that maybe are a step ahead of the science in some cases when nations feel they have to act in their interests. Is this something that's going to stand in the way of reaching some agreements with the United States, which has focused for years on some of the science-based principles? Is that something? I see you nodding, Ambassador Pierce, a little bit there in your negotiation with the U.S.
Thank you, Ken. I think it's a very good point. The US has very much been led by the science at the heart of its trading relations. We would say we have as well. And UK and US science, for all sorts of historical and cultural reasons, is actually very close, and our researchers and our medics, etc., have very close links. So I would hope that those close links would mean we didn't get into a significant problem in the FTA or on particular sectors. But I think the general point is very well taken. Because of COVID, everybody is nervous. Everybody is nervous about vaccine supply. Everybody is nervous about PPE supply. If you're the United States of America, you can reassure to an amazing extent you're a continent. Europe, including EU, UK, Australia, Brazil, it's much harder for us to behave in that way. We need a diversification of supply chains, and we need to be not reliant on one particular sort of supplier, especially if that supplier belongs to the authoritarian tendency. And this is one of the things we want to look at in the G7 presidency. We have an economic resilience panel, and we do want to look at this supply chain issue, this question of how do we rely on each other? How do we avoid vaccine nationalism, to coin a phrase? Because I think it's going to be very important for the next few years.
Yes, Arthur.
I was just going to say, on this issue of science, it's just a matter of being consistent and not picking science for one product or one good as opposed to another. So, for example, in the agricultural space, using science consistently across the board and making sure that it's not being used as a cover for protection. So this is something that particularly agricultural nations, commodity nations, a lot of developing countries are very sensitive about. They sometimes think, well, you know, we see some of the science standards in Western countries and we worry that they're being used more to protect rather than to maintain appropriate standards. So I think the main thing is to be able to be consistent about that, and that requires being able to understand each other, the science, being transparent about it, and how it's being used. And as we get into more and more standards being put into trade agreements, it'll be very important for countries to understand the basis of those standards and have a transparency around them. And this administration seems to be quite interested in putting more and more standards into agreements. That's fine, as long as we all understand what it means, what the implications are, and as long as we're all working to keep the global trading system open, because one of the best things we can do as we come out of the pandemic is to give the world economy a message that trade and investment are going to be promoted rather than hindered.
We don't take positions on the trade issues, but we are pro-trade, and we certainly agree with that statement. Yeah. I'm going to turn to Ambassador Forster today. Today, Ambassador, apparently, and I didn't hear this myself, but the questioner said that White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki was asked about the relationship with Brazil today. And she underscored a commitment to expanding trade and investment with Brazil, I am told, despite some concerns maybe raised by some lawmakers and NGOs. What are your thoughts on those comments? And do you see some next steps in U.S.-Brazil trade relations?
Thank you for that question. Yes, that's a very welcome remark, and shows, you know, that we're on the right track, pushing to expand and deepen and broaden what we have on the table right now. You know, everybody knows about the priority that this administration attaches to the whole question of, you know, sustainable development, climate change, and so on. And Brazil is also fully on board to tackle all those issues. You know, we don't think that we should wait for one thing or the other. We should keep moving in all directions, cooperating in trade and all trade issues, and at the same time working on you know, on environmental issues. We can do a lot bilaterally. We can also do a lot, I think, multilaterally. When you know, if we have a Paris Agreement, if you go back to the original negotiations, I think the understanding between Brazil and the United States went a long way And it might be argued that, for the success of the upcoming COP in November in Glasgow, that would be the case. It's important that we work together, we cooperate in areas of common interest, which are many at this point. But back to the trade, what we want is to keep moving, keep working with the United States, seeking to improve the American investment in Brazil, which historically has been number one as a single country. The European Union has the largest stock taken, as a group, as one entity. But the United States, as an individual country, has a tremendous presence in Brazil in terms of investment, and we want to keep that. And trade is a good part of fostering that investment, make sure it continues to grow, and it continues to grow here in the United States as well. Brazilian investment has increased fourfold in the past 10 years, generating thousands of jobs in this country, which is our common concern. So that would be it.
Thank you. Thank you. Before we go, and we have to wrap up, I promised to get you all done by 5. We did have a question that came in about digital services taxes. It's a thorn in the side of the relations between the US and the EU, US and UK right now. Dame Pierce, any thoughts on that? You have your G7 coming up. Seems that there might be some interest in trying to resolve some of these issues before we can maybe even move forward on some of the other matters at hand.
Well, thanks, Ken. And this is another issue that we would very much like to resolve. The way is there to resolve it through the OECD and to have a global discussion and agreement as to how we manage things like a digital services tax. And for the UK, we are very ready to negotiate this in the OECD. The previous American administration were less willing to come to the OECD to negotiate. We're talking to the Biden administration in the hope that we'll be able to do this across the OECD. I would just say that although we have in theory imposed a digital service tax, we are not collecting it at the moment. And this is precisely to encourage the administration to come and negotiate with us and others in the OECD.
And I would second Karen's plea, and I noticed with great optimism that Janet Yellen, in her confirmation hearing, indicated that the willingness of the U.S. to return to these discussions. So it's obvious that digital companies have to pay more tax. It's just the fair and the right thing today to do. And I think that I think even the companies themselves will agree to that. So looking at how this happens and where they pay them, that's something that the OECD can discuss, and we are very ready to engage as well.
Thank you. I am very grateful to all of you. Thank you so much for the pleasure of your time. Thank you for joining us in this virtual setting. It is my deep and sincere hope that we are able to be meeting in person in a live setting in the months to come, maybe in the latter half of 2021. And we'd like to welcome all of you back again to WTO, whether as a part of a group or in a one-on-one conversation, to hear more about the issues that are important to your countries. We are open to all of you. We are very grateful to having you join us today. This is it for the day, for our panels for today. We're going to be starting bright and early at 9 a.m. Eastern time tomorrow with Ambassador Alan Wolf, the WTO's Deputy Director General and one of the acting Director Generals until Dr. Ngozi assumes her position. So we look forward to seeing all of you then. Thanks again to the ambassadors for joining us today. Really appreciate your time. Hope you all are well and stay safe. And everybody, best of luck for you and your countries in navigating through the pandemic and in working with this new administration. You all mentioned the incoming U.S. Trade Representative, Catherine Tai. We are as well very excited about her appointment, as well as, of course, hoping that Dr. Ngozi is confirmed shortly into her post. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Ambassador Schwab. You've been a dear friend to us, and we look forward to seeing all of you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.